What the Bible had already solved the gut health crisis that's destroying modern civilization, not with supplements, not with probiotic capsules from a pharmaceutical lab, but with something far older, far simpler, and far more powerful: fermentation. The process of using living bacteria, wild yeast, and time to transform food into something the body can actually heal with. And here's the part that will shake you. The Bible didn't just mention fermented foods in passing. It built entire cultures, rituals, and covenants around them. The land flowing with milk and honey wasn't just poetry. It was a prescription. Modern gastroenterologists are now calling the gut the second brain. They're spending billions of dollars researching the microbiome, the ecosystem of bacteria that controls your immune system, your mood, your inflammation levels, your longevity. And what they keep finding over and over again is this: the ancient world was already feeding that ecosystem perfectly. Today I'm going to show you 20 fermented foods straight from the pages of scripture that science is now proving can rebuild your gut, reverse inflammation, and change your health at a cellular level. Stick around, because number 13 on this list combines two of the most powerful antimicrobial substances in human history into a single ferment that modern researchers are calling extraordinary. And number 20 is the one that came before wine, before vinegar, before any refined drink humanity ever produced. It is packed with enzymes and living compounds that the finished product is already lost by the time it hits your glass. If you want ancient wisdom backed by modern science every single week, hit subscribe right now and ring that bell. We post every week on recreational roots, and we are just getting started. Let's get into it. Here are 20 biblical ferments, ranked from extraordinary to absolutely life-changing. Number 1. Yogurt. Laban, the food Abraham served angels. Let's start at the very beginning. And in the biblical world, that beginning is curdled milk. In Genesis 18, when 3 heavenly visitors appear at Abraham's tent in the heat of the desert afternoon, he doesn't serve them bread alone. He brings butter and milk, what scholars of ancient Near Eastern food identify as Laban, the fermented milk product that is a direct ancestor of what you find in the dairy aisle of every grocery store from Portland, Oregon to Jacksonville, Florida. Abraham fed this to angels. That is not a trivial detail. In the ancient world, you served guests the best you had, and Laban was the best. What is Laban? It is milk that has been naturally fermented by lactic acid bacteria, specifically lactobacillus and streptococcus strains, that transform lactose into lactic acid. This process predigests the milk proteins, making them dramatically easier for the human gut to absorb. It created a tart, thick, living food packed with beneficial bacteria that the gut recognizes as allies, not invaders. Modern clinical research has confirmed what Abraham's household already knew. Regular yogurt consumption is associated with reduced gut permeability, what researchers call leaky gut. Studies show it improves lactose digestion, even in lactose-intolerant individuals, because the bacteria have already done the digestive work before the food reaches your gut. It reduces markers of systemic inflammation. It supports immune function. And it provides calcium, phosphorus, potassium, and B vitamins in a highly bioavailable form, because fermentation dramatically increases mineral absorption. Think about how many American families have yogurt in the refrigerator right now and have absolutely no idea they are participating in a food tradition that stretches back for 1,000 years to a tent in the ancient Near East. The problem is most commercial yogurt in American supermarkets has been pasteurized after fermentation, which kills the very bacteria that make it healing. When you see live and active cultures on the label, that matters. When you make it yourself or buy it from a small producer who doesn't heat treat after fermentation, you are getting the real thing, the thing Abraham considered worthy of angels. Traditional use was direct and daily. Laban eaten at every meal as a condiment, a beverage, a base for sauces, diluted with water and salt as a refreshing drink in the desert heat. Thickened further into labna, a soft spreadable cheese eaten with olive oil and herbs. This wasn't supplementation. This was the foundational food of an entire civilization. And it is the perfect place to begin. Number 2, kefir, the grain of the nomads. If yogurt is a calm, consistent delivery of beneficial bacteria, kefir is something else entirely. Something wilder, more complex, and more biologically diverse. And its origins stretch back to the nomadic herdsmen of the ancient Caucasus and Near East, exactly the world the biblical patriarchs inhabited as they moved their flocks across terrain that stretched from what is now Turkey down to the Jordan Valley and into the Sinai. Kefir is made from kefir grains, which are not grains at all but complex colonies of bacteria and yeast living together in a symbiotic matrix that looks like small cauliflower florets. These grains, when added to fresh milk, fermented into a slightly effervescent, tangy, living drink. Where yogurt typically contains a handful of bacterial strains, authentic kefir contains dozens, including Lactobacillus kefiri, various Laconistoc species, and beneficial yeasts like Saccharomyces cerevisiae. The microbial diversity of kefir is closer to the complexity of a healthy human gut than almost any other food on the planet. The research on kefir is extraordinary. A clinical trial showed kefir consumption significantly reduced gut inflammation in participants with irritable bowel syndrome, a condition that now affects roughly 15% of the American population, from suburban Texas to rural Appalachia. Studies show kefir outperforms standard yogurt in reducing Helicobacter pylori, the bacterium responsible for most stomach ulcers. Kefir contains compounds called Kefir polysaccharides with documented anti-tumor, antifungal, and anti-inflammatory properties. And unlike most fermented milks, kefir is nearly completely lactose-free because the organisms consume virtually all of it during fermentation. The nomadic herdsmen who carried kefir grains in leather pouches across desert trade routes weren't doing it for taste alone. They were carrying medicine, live, portable, self-renewing medicine that kept them healthy while armies and city dwellers fell disease. You can buy kefir grains online today for a few dollars, put them in a jar of whole milk, leave it on your kitchen counter overnight, and have in your hands the same living culture that sustained human health across thousands of miles and thousands of years of some of the harshest living conditions humanity has ever faced. Traditional use was 1 cup daily, often on an empty stomach in the morning. This is the most biodiverse probiotic food on this entire list, and it costs almost nothing to make at home once you have the grains. Number 3. Raw goat milk yogurt, the milk of the promised land. We talked about goat's milk in our biblical superfoods video. But fermented goat's milk is a different conversation entirely, because fermentation transforms goat's milk from good to exceptional in ways that modern dairy science is only beginning to fully understand. If you live in Colorado or Vermont or the hill country of Central Texas, you may already know someone raising dairy goats. You may already be drinking milk that is one step away from something extraordinary. That step is fermentation. The land flowing with milk and honey was goat country. Sheep and goat herds fed the biblical world. The milk came fresh, was fermented immediately in clay pots or goat skin bags by naturally occurring bacteria from the animals, the environment, and the vessels themselves. What resulted was a raw living yogurt with bacterial diversity that modern commercial yogurt simply cannot replicate. Raw fermented goat milk contains a full complement of naturally occurring lactoferrin, an immune-modulating protein that is destroyed by pasteurization. It contains conjugated linoleic acid, a fatty acid shown in studies to reduce body fat, improve insulin sensitivity, and demonstrate anti-cancer properties. The smaller fat globules in goat's milk mean the bacteria during fermentation have greater surface access, producing a more thoroughly fermented, more digestible product than the cow's milk equivalent. Studies on raw fermented dairy show it supports the development of healthy immune tolerance in children, is associated with lower rates of asthma and allergy, and provides a living ecosystem of bacteria that has been shown to survive stomach acid and reach the colon intact far more reliably than commercially pasteurized yogurt. This is a food that built the gut health of entire civilizations in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. And it is available to you right now if you can find a small local dairy, a farmer's market vendor, or raise a couple goats on a backyard homestead. Traditional use was fresh, raw, fermented daily, straight from the vessel that made it. Simple, direct, and extraordinarily effective. Number 4. Cheese, curds, and soft cheeses. What David carried to the battlefield. Here is a military detail that most people read right past. In 1 Samuel 17, when David is sent by his father Jesse to bring supplies to his brothers fighting at the front lines against the Philistines, the supply list includes 10 cuts of cheese to be delivered directly to the commander of the army. This was not casual snacking. This was battlefield nutrition. And someone in that Israelite household understood that fermented dairy was what fighting men needed to stay strong, stay sharp, and stay alive. Early biblical cheeses were not the aged hard blocks you find vacuum sealed in a grocery store in Charlotte or Cincinnati. They were soft, fresh, lactic acid fermented curds. Essentially what we would call farmer's cheese, fresh chèvre, or cottage cheese today. Milk was soured naturally, curdled, strained through cloth, and pressed lightly. The result was a concentrated, protein-dense, mineral-rich food with the beneficial bacteria of fermentation still fully active. Modern research on traditionally produced soft cheeses confirms significant probiotic content, particularly Lactococcus lactis and Laconistoc species, alongside concentrated calcium, phosphorus, and fat-soluble vitamins A and K2. And vitamin K2, found in fermented dairy but almost entirely absent from the modern Western diet, has emerged in recent research as a critical nutrient for directing calcium into bones and teeth rather than arterial walls. Studies link K2 deficiency to arterial calcification and cardiovascular disease. Biblical armies eating fresh fermented cheese were getting one of the most important heart protective nutrients in existence. And they had no idea. They just knew it worked. They knew warriors needed it. They knew it was worth carrying across rough terrain on the back of a donkey to the front lines of battle. Dense, portable, shelf-stable, without refrigeration, because a fermentation process is itself a preservation system. Traditional use was fresh curds eaten daily with bread and olives. Soft cheese stored in olive oil or brine to extend preservation across weeks of travel. Number 5. Sourdough bread, the bread of life, fermented. When Jesus calls himself the bread of life in John chapter 6, he is speaking to a crowd that has just been fed multiplied barley loaves. Not white sandwich bread. Not bread made with commercial instant yeast from a packet. Bread made the way bread had been made for thousands of years before and after, slowly, with wild fermentation, using nothing but grain, water, and the living yeast and bacteria present in the air and the flour itself. Sourdough fermentation is a two-part biological process. Wild lactobacillus bacteria produce lactic and acetic acids that give the bread its characteristic tang and dramatically improve its nutritional profile. Wild yeast produce the carbon dioxide that leavens the dough, making it rise without any commercial additive. Together, over a long, slow fermentation that could take anywhere from 12 to 48 hours, they accomplish something remarkable. They break down gluten proteins, reducing their inflammatory potential. They neutralize phytic acid, the anti-nutrient in grain that otherwise blocks the absorption of iron, zinc, and calcium. They pre-digest complex starches, lowering the bread's glycemic index dramatically compared to commercial bread. There's a reason the sourdough revival in America started in San Francisco, a city with particular wild yeast culture in its fog-drenched air that produces a flavor unlike any other sourdough on earth. But what began as a California artisan trend is actually a rediscovery of the only way bread was ever made for most of human history. Studies comparing sourdough to commercial yeast bread show sourdough produces a significantly lower blood sugar response. People who react to modern wheat often tolerate properly fermented sourdough without symptoms. The fermentation makes the minerals in the grain up to 50% more bioavailable. This is the bread that sustained the ancient world through famines, military campaigns, and centuries of hard physical labor under desert sun. The grain of the Bible was not the problem. The way we stop fermenting it is the problem. Traditional use was long fermented whole grain baked in a clay oven, eaten daily with olive oil, soft curds, and vegetables. This was the original balanced meal. Number 6. Fermented honey, mead, the ancient sacred drink. The phrase "the land flowing with milk and honey" appears 11 times in the Hebrew scriptures. 11 times. That phrase was not just describing abundance in general terms. It was pointing to two of the most medically powerful fermented substances known to the ancient world. We have covered raw honey in previous videos. But here is what most people do not know. Honey ferments naturally, spontaneously, under the right conditions. Raw honey with sufficient moisture content becomes mead, one of the oldest fermented beverages in human history. Archaeological evidence for mead predates wine by several thousand years. When honey ferments, the natural yeast present in raw honey, primarily Saccharomyces species, convert the sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide while preserving and even concentrating many of the antimicrobial and antioxidant compounds that make honey medicinal in the first place. The resulting drink contains a polyphenol of raw honey, including flavonoids and phenolic acids, alongside the probiotic byproducts of fermentation, including organic acids and trace beneficial yeasts. Traditional mead was not the heavily sweetened, high-alcohol drink of medieval European lore that you might have seen at a Renaissance fair in Virginia or North Carolina. Ancient mead was lightly fermented, low in alcohol, drunk young, and consumed as medicine as much as beverage. The combination of honey's hydrogen peroxide activity, its flavonoids, and the organic acids of fermentation creates an antimicrobial environment that is genuinely therapeutic. Studies on honey wine show anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties that neither water nor plain honey alone possess. Traditional use was lightly fermented raw honey in water, consumed in moderation as a daily tonic or medicinally at the first sign of infection. The most ancient health drink humanity ever produced. Number 7. Wine, the ancient ferment of communion. No list of biblical ferments is complete without wine. We cover the medicinal nuances of wine in our superfoods video. So I want to stay focused here on the fermentation science, because that is where the real story lives. The The fermentation of grape juice into wine is one of the most complex biological processes in food production. Hundreds of yeast strains, bacteria, and enzymatic reactions transform simple sugars into a drink containing resveratrol, proanthocyanidins, quercetin, and dozens of other polyphenol that are not present in unfermented grape juice at the same concentrations. Fermentation creates these compounds, or concentrates them, or unlocks them from forms the body cannot otherwise use. Wild fermentation, the kind used throughout the biblical world without added sulfites or commercial yeast, also produces beneficial organic acids and probiotic byproducts that commercial wine processing largely eliminates. The wine regions of the Finger Lakes in New York, the vineyards spreading across Napa and Sonoma in California, the small family operations dotting the foothills of Virginia, all of them are working with a fermentation tradition that stretches back to Noah planting his vineyard after flood. The polyphenol in traditionally fermented red wine are the focus of some of the most compelling cardiovascular research of the past 3 decades. Resveratrol activates sirtuin proteins associated with cellular repair and longevity. Proanthocyanidins from grape seeds and skins have potent anti-inflammatory effects. Multiple large-scale studies link moderate traditional wine consumption to reduce cardiovascular mortality, improve gut microbiome diversity, and lower inflammatory markers. The key distinction is always quality and quantity. Biblical wine was consumed diluted with water, with food, in community. It was medicine taken contextually, not a substance consumed to intoxication. Used that way, a small glass of quality red with a meal, the fermentation science behind wine, is as compelling as anything else on this list. Number 8. Date wine, the desert ferment of survival. The date palm is mentioned more times in the Bible and the Quran combined than any other fruit tree. And dates do not just feed you. They ferment. Date wine, produced by pressing overripe dates into juice and allowing wild yeast to ferment the natural sugars, was a common beverage across ancient Mesopotamia, Arabia, and the Levant, often more available than grape wine in the deep desert regions where grapes could not grow. Date wine fermentation produces a drink rich in the polyphenol and flavonoids of dates themselves. Compounds including percyanidin and ferulic acid that have documented anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. The fermentation process breaks down the complex sugars in dates, producing a lower glycemic beverage than the fruit itself, while concentrating the minerals potassium, magnesium, and copper in quantities relevant to human health. Clinical research on date polyphenol shows inhibition of LDL oxidation, reduction of platelet aggregation, and liver protective effects. One study found date extract as effective as aspirin at reducing platelet clumping, which is directly relevant to cardiovascular risk. The fermented form delivers these compounds in a probiotic medium alongside organic acids that support gut health. Think about what this meant in practical terms. Desert travelers with no access to grape vineyards, moving across terrain that would be familiar to anyone who has driven to the Sonoran Desert of Arizona or the high desert of New Mexico. These people had a fermented medicine they could produce in the trees that grew wild around every oasis. They did not know the mechanism. They knew the result. They kept making it for thousands of years. Traditional use was lightly fermented, consumed young, often mixed with water as a daily beverage across months of difficult travel. Number 9. Fig wine, the ferment of prophets. We know figs were medicinal in the biblical world. When the prophet Isaiah was called to treat King Hezekiah, who was dying of what appears to have been a severe infected wound, Isaiah's prescription was a poultice of figs applied directly to the wound. The antimicrobial and drawing properties of concentrated fig compounds were understood intuitively by a prophet who had no access to a medical journal. But figs also ferment beautifully into a rich, deeply colored wine that concentrates every one of the health properties of the raw fruit, while adding the benefits of fermentation on top. Fig wine produced from fresh or dried figs allowed to ferment in water with their naturally occurring wild yeast has a history in the ancient Middle East stretching back more than 5,000 years. The fermentation preserves and concentrates benzaldehyde, the compound in figs with documented anti-tumor properties, in preliminary research. It preserves phycin, the digestive enzyme unique to figs that has antiparasitic effects and supports protein digestion in ways that rival prescription digestive aids. And the polyphenol content of fermented figs, including anthocyanins, chlorogenic acid, and rutin, is significant by any measure. Fig ferments are extraordinarily rich in soluble fiber, converted to prebiotic compounds during the fermentation process, providing sustained fuel for the beneficial bacteria of the colon. The mineral density of figs, particularly their calcium and magnesium content, is maintained through fermentation, while becoming more bioavailable through the acidic fermentation environment. If you live in Southern California, Florida, or along the Gulf Coast. You may have fig trees in your own yard right now dropping fruit you are not using. Those overripe figs falling to ground are exactly the raw material the ancient world used to make a fermented medicine that prophets trusted and history validated. Traditional use was fresh or dried figs fermented in water with a touch of wild honey as a starter, consumed as a daily digestive tonic. The ancient world wasted nothing that could ferment. Number 10. Fermented olives. The living food hiding in plain sight. The olive is so central to biblical life that it barely needs introduction. The Mount of Olives outside Jerusalem. The olive branch of peace. The oil burning in temple lamps. But here is the aspect almost everyone overlooks. The olives they ate were not raw, and they were not just pressed into oil. They were fermented, because raw olives are completely inedible. Profoundly, bitterly, mouth-numbingly inedible. The compound responsible for that bitterness is oleuropein, one of the most potent antioxidants known in the plant kingdom, and one of the most powerfully antimicrobial natural compounds ever identified. To eat olives, the ancient world fermented them, cured in brine, packed in salt, or soaked in water with aromatic herbs for weeks or months. The natural lactic acid bacteria on the olive skin, primarily Lactobacillus plantarum, ferment the sugars and gradually break down the bitterness while producing a living probiotic food. Lactobacillus plantarum is one of the most studied probiotic organisms in clinical research. It has been shown to reduce gut permeability, inhibit the growth of pathogenic bacteria, including Listeria and E. coli, reduce intestinal inflammation, and produce compounds that support colon health. It survives stomach acid better than almost any other lactobacillus strain, meaning it actually reaches a colon intact to do its work. And the oleuropein that survives the fermentation process intact is one of the most studied anti-inflammatory, antiviral, and antihypertensive natural compounds in nutritional medicine. The problem is that most olives sold in American grocery stores, whether in California's Central Valley or on the shelves of deli in Manhattan, have been cured with lye and then heat processed or packed in vinegar, both of which destroy the living cultures and dramatically reduce the oleuropein content. Traditional fermented olives cured in nothing but sea salt brine with wild herbs are completely different food from what most Americans eat. Finding real, traditionally brine-cured olives at a specialty market or making them yourself is one of the single highest value nutritional upgrades available. The ancient world ate them at every meal, at every table, in every household. They just did not know the mechanism. They knew the result. Number 11. Pickled cucumbers. Ancient pickles. Now what you think? Here's a distinction that changes everything you thought you knew about pickles. The cucumbers the Israelites mourned in Numbers 11, the cucumbers of Egypt they wept for in the wilderness, were not preserved in vinegar. Vinegar pickling is a modern industrial shortcut developed for shelf stability and uniform flavor. Ancient pickling was lacto-fermentation. Cucumbers submerged in a salt brine and allowed to ferment by naturally occurring lactobacillus bacteria on the surface of the vegetable itself. No vinegar. No heat processing, just salt, water, and time. The difference is not subtle. Vinegar-pickled cucumbers are essentially dead food. The acid kills all bacteria, including the beneficial ones, and the heat processing used in commercial canning destroys enzymes and degrades water-soluble vitamins. Lacto-fermented cucumbers are living food packed with Lactobacillus plantarum and other lactic acid bacteria, active enzymes, and the full vitamin content of the original vegetable, often enhanced through the fermentation process itself. If you grew up in New York City, you may have encountered the real thing without knowing it. The old-school kosher dill pickles from barrels at Jewish delis in the Lower East Side. Those were traditionally lacto-fermented, not vinegar-brined. The vendors knew they were different. The customers knew they were different. They just did not always know why. What they were selling was a 4,000-year-old technology dressed up in wax paper and deli counter ambience. Studies comparing vinegar pickles and lacto-fermented pickles show the latter provide measurable probiotic content that survives into the gut, while vinegar pickles provide essentially none. Lacto-fermented cucumbers also retain and concentrate cucurbitacin compounds, bitter plant chemicals with documented anti-inflammatory and anti-tumor properties in preliminary research. Traditional use was cucumbers in salt brine with garlic, fresh dill, and grape leaves, which contain tannins that keep the cucumbers crisp during fermentation. Fermented at room temperature for 3 to 7 days. This is one of the easiest ferments on this list to make at home, and one of the most profoundly different from its commercial imitation. Number 12. Fermented turnips. The purple ferment of the ancient kitchen. Here is one that surprises people. Fermented turnips, bright magenta from the addition of a slice of raw beet, tart and crunchy and alive, are not a recent culinary trend showing up on the menu of some farm-to-table restaurant in Asheville or Austin. They are one of the oldest continuously made fermented foods in the Middle East, eaten without interruption across Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine for thousands of years. They are almost certainly part of the preserved food tradition that fed the biblical world through winters and long desert journeys, when fresh vegetables were unavailable. Turnips, like all brassica vegetables, contain glucosinolates, sulfur compounds that when fermented are converted by lactobacillus bacteria into isothiocyanates and other bioactive compounds. These compounds have been the subject of intense anti-cancer research for decades. Studies on fermented cruciferous vegetables show the fermentation process dramatically increases the bioavailability of sulforaphane, the glucosinolate breakdown product that has shown the most potent anti-cancer and cellular detoxification effects in clinical research. Broccoli sprout extracts standardized for sulforaphane content are now in multiple cancer prevention clinical trials. Fermented turnips were delivering precursor compounds into the same biochemical pathways thousands of years before anyone knew what a glucosinolate was. The brine of fermented turnips is also extraordinarily rich in lactic acid bacteria. Studies on traditional Middle Eastern fermented turnips have identified strains of Lactobacillus brevis and Laconistoc mesenteroids with documented immunomodulatory properties. Traditional use was sliced turnips with a wedge of raw beet and a salt brine, fermented for 5 to 7 days. Still eaten today throughout the Levant as a daily condiment alongside hummus and fresh flatbread. This ferment never died because it was simply too good to abandon. Number 13. Fermented garlic honey, the antimicrobial masterwork. Here we are, number 13, the one I told you about at the very beginning of this video. And I want you to understand exactly why this deserves its own extended spotlight before we get into the science. Because this is not just a combination of two powerful foods. This is a synergistic fermentation that produces something neither ingredient can accomplish alone. Raw garlic is one of the most comprehensively studied antimicrobial foods in existence. The allicin produced when a garlic clove is crushed or chopped has been shown to kill bacteria, viruses, and fungi with a potency that routinely surprises researchers who are not expecting a kitchen ingredient to perform like a pharmaceutical compound. Raw honey is one of the most comprehensively studied antimicrobial foods in existence, with its hydrogen peroxide activity, low water content, and unique phytocompounds creating an environment where pathogens simply cannot survive. When you ferment garlic cloves submerged in raw honey, you do not simply combine them. You trigger a fermentation process driven by the wild yeast and bacteria in the raw honey, using the sugars of both the honey and the garlic as fuel. The result is a transformation. The allicin in garlic is partially broken down into more stable sulfur compounds that are actually easier for the body to absorb and utilize than allicin in its raw form. The honey's antimicrobial compounds are joined by the organic acids and beneficial byproducts of fermentation, creating a more complex and more potent antimicrobial profile than unfermented honey alone. The garlic cloves themselves mellow dramatically over the 30-day fermentation, becoming almost sweet, deeply savory, and intensely complex in a way that raw garlic is not. A study on honey fermentation found that fermented honey develops higher antioxidant capacity and more complex antimicrobial profiles than unfermented honey. The combination also provides the prebiotic inulin compounds from garlic, feeding the beneficial bacteria that the honey's fermentation byproducts support simultaneously. It is a self-contained ecosystem of healing compounds working in coordination. The ancient world did not have double-blind clinical trials. They had centuries of accumulated observation. And someone at some point in the ancient Near East figured out that garlic preserved in honey and left to ferment was more powerful than either one alone. They were right. Traditional use was raw garlic cloves submerged completely in raw honey, fermented at room temperature for a minimum of 30 days. 1 to 3 cloves eaten daily with a teaspoon of the fermented honey during illness or as a daily tonic. This is the ferment that deserves to be in every home in America, from the apartments of Chicago to the farmhouses of rural Georgia. It costs almost nothing to make. It lasts for months, and the science behind it is as compelling as anything in a pharmacy. Number 14. Lacto-fermented carrots, the medicine root. The carrot's wild ancestor was native to the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, specifically the purple, red, and yellow varieties that predate the familiar orange Dutch carrot by several millennia. If you've ever been to a farmer's market in Seattle or Denver or Raleigh and seen those bundles of rainbow carrots in deep purple and golden yellow, you've seen something much closer to the original than the uniform orange variety that most Americans grew up pulling from the ground in their grandmother's backyard garden. Purple carrots in particular contain anthocyanins, the deep purple pigments with powerful antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties that modern researchers are investigating for cardiovascular protection and cognitive preservation. But lacto-fermented carrots, any variety, salt brine, and allowed to ferment by naturally occurring lactobacillus bacteria, transform these already nutrient-dense roots in ways that raw carrots simply cannot replicate. The fermentation process converts some of the complex carrot carbohydrates into short-chain fatty acids, the primary fuel source for the cells lining the colon. Without adequate short-chain fatty acid production, those colon cells begin to deteriorate, a process increasingly linked to colorectal cancer, which is now rising in younger Americans at rates that are alarming physicians across the country. The fermentation also increases the bioavailability of beta-carotene, the precursor to vitamin A, by breaking down the cell walls that normally protect it from absorption. Studies show fermented vegetables provide significantly higher levels of bioavailable beta-carotene than either raw or cooked equivalents. The lactic acid bacteria produced during carrot fermentation include strains shown to stimulate the production of regulatory T cells, the immune cells responsible for preventing autoimmune overreaction. In a population where autoimmune conditions have become an epidemic, affecting tens of millions of Americans from New England to the Pacific coast, this is not a trivial finding. Traditional use was carrot sticks or rounds in salt brine with garlic, cumin, and fresh herbs, fermented 3 to 5 days at room temperature, eaten daily as a condiment, a snack, or the opening bite of a meal. The medicine root of the ancient world is still available to you. It just needs to ferment first. Number 15. Fermented barley, ancient beer, the grain drink of laborers. Barley bread multiplied into the loaves that fed 5,000. But barley in the biblical world did not only become bread. Soaked in water and allowed to ferment with wild yeast and bacteria, barley becomes a mildly alcoholic, probiotic-rich, nutritionally dense fermented beverage that fed the laborers of the ancient world. Egyptian pyramid builders, Mesopotamian soldiers, Israelite workers building the great construction projects of the ancient Near East, in exactly the way modern sports drinks claim to but functionally cannot. This ancient barley drink is not modern craft beer. It was thick, low in alcohol, rich in fermenting grain solids, and consumed as much for nutrition as anything else. The fermentation activated barley's extraordinary beta-glucan content, the soluble fiber that now carries FDA-approved cholesterol-lowering health claims on oat packaging across American grocery stores. It produced B vitamins, particularly riboflavin and niacin, at levels that provided genuine nutritional insurance for workers subsisting on limited diets. Studies on traditionally fermented grain beverages show significantly higher B vitamin content than unfermented grains, a difference that was a difference between deficiency disease and the functional health needed to haul stone across desert terrain. The lactic acid bacteria in fermented barley also produce bacteriocins, natural antimicrobial compounds that inhibit food spoilage and pathogenic bacteria. This made fermented barley safer to drink than standing water in a world without water sanitation. That single fact kept enormous populations alive through periods when waterborne illness was the leading cause of death. Fermented barley was not just food, it was public health infrastructure. Traditional use was whole soaked barley, fermented 2 to 3 days, strained and consumed fresh, ideally mixed with raw honey for sweetness and additional antimicrobial activity. Nutrition delivery at a civilization scale. Number 16. Boza, the living grain porridge that predates writing. If fermented barley is the drink of laborers, boza is the drink of community. Boza is a thick, slightly sweet, slightly sour fermented grain beverage made from barley, wheat, or millet, and has been consumed continuously across the ancient Near East and Mediterranean for more than 8,000 years. 8,000 years. It predates writing. It predates most of recorded human civilization, and it is still sold by street vendors in Istanbul and Cairo today, poured from large tin containers into small cups for morning commuters who have no idea they are drinking something older than the pyramids. Boza fermentation involves a complex community of lactic acid bacteria and yeast working simultaneously, producing a beverage with a lower alcohol content than wine, but a far richer probiotic and nutritional profile than clear fermented drinks. The suspended grain particles mean boza delivers protein, fiber, and minerals alongside the living cultures in a single drink. Studies on boza have identified Lactobacillus acidophilus, Leuconostoc mesenteroids, and Saccharomyces cerevisiae as dominant organisms, a community of microorganisms that collectively support immune function, reduce gut inflammation, and provide sustained energy across a long workday. Traditional boza was given specifically to nursing mothers, convalescents, and young children, the populations where nutrition and gut health are most critical, where deficiency can have the most serious consequences. That is not coincidence. That is 8,000 years of observational medicine. Communities across the ancient world kept their most vulnerable members alive with this ferment through winters, through sieges, through the brutal agricultural hardship that defined most of human history until very recently. Traditional use was freshly fermented, consumed within days of preparation, served thick with a sprinkle of cinnamon and roasted chickpeas on top. The oldest living ferment on this list. Number 17. Fermented lentil batter, the food of prophets. We know lentils from the story of Esau's birthright, the red stew so fragrant and compelling that Esau traded his entire inheritance for a bowl of it. We know them as a survival food of the ancient poor, the protein backbone of populations that could not afford meat. But fermented lentils soaked, ground, and allowed to ferment with wild bacteria before being cooked as flatbread or porridge are a nutritional transformation of an already extraordinary food. The fermentation of lentil batter drives a remarkable biochemical process. Phytic acid, the primary anti-nutrient in legumes that binds to iron, zinc, and calcium and prevents their absorption, is largely neutralized. Multiple studies on fermented lentil preparations show iron bioavailability increases by up to 85% after fermentation compared to unfermented lentil porridge. 85%. Zinc bioavailability increases comparably. For populations dependent on plant-based protein in a world without multivitamins or iron supplements, this difference was the difference between health and deficiency disease, between children who developed normally and children who did not. The fermentation also produces resistant starch and prebiotic compounds from the lentil fiber that unfermented lentils cannot provide, and the gas-producing oligosaccharides in legumes that cause a digestive discomfort familiar to anyone who has made too ambitious a batch of lentil soup on a Sunday afternoon in a small apartment are significantly reduced by fermentation, making the lentils dramatically gentler on the gut. The prophet who ate lentil stew was not eating inferior food. He was eating transformed food. Food that fermentation had made more available, more digestible, and more nourishing than anything that could come directly from a field. Traditional use was soaked in ground lentils, fermented overnight, cooked as flatbread or thick porridge with cumin, coriander, and olive oil, the breakfast of the ancient Near East. Number 18. Fermented cabbage, ancient sauerkraut, the long traveler's medicine. Cabbage is ancient in the Middle East. Wild cabbage grew throughout the Mediterranean and was cultivated early in human agricultural history. And humans discovered very early that salted, packed cabbage ferments spontaneously into something that lasts for months without refrigeration, maintained its vitamin C content through long winters when no fresh vegetables are available, and becomes more medically active with every passing week of fermentation. That last point is worth sitting with. The food becomes more healing over time, not less, more. Salt-packed, naturally fermented cabbage is one of the most studied fermented foods in modern nutritional research. The dominant organism, Leuconostoc mesenteroids, produces bacteriocins that inhibit a wide range of foodborne pathogens, creating a self-preserving food that was literally safer to eat after 6 weeks of fermentation than fresh vegetables pulled from a field irrigated with contaminated water. Studies on sauerkraut fermentation show isothiocyanate content. The anti-cancer glucosinolate breakdown products we discuss with fermented turnips is maximized through lacto-fermentation and is not produced in significant amounts through cooking or vinegar preservation. A landmark study found that Polish immigrants in the United States showed dramatically lower rates of breast cancer than the general population, and that the difference correlated with traditional fermented cabbage consumption. The researchers identified specific fermentation compounds from brassica fermentation as potentially protective. If you are in Chicago, Milwaukee, or anywhere in the upper Midwest where Polish and German immigrant communities maintain their fermentation traditions, you may live in a neighborhood where that knowledge is still alive and still being practiced in home kitchens. That knowledge is worth preserving. Long-haul traders carrying fermented cabbage across ancient trade routes were not just preserving food for the journey. They were carrying a cancer-preventive medicine they could not name, but intuitively understood to be vital. Traditional use was shredded cabbage packed tightly with sea salt, weighted down and fermented 2 to 4 weeks, 1 to 2 tablespoons daily with meals. Number 19. Fermented fish, garum style, the secret ingredient of ancient civilization. This one challenges people because it sounds primitive. It sounds like something desperate. But fermented fish sauce was not the crude food of the poor. It was the most prized condiment in the ancient Mediterranean world, so valuable that Roman traders carried it on ships across the entire known world. Archaeologists have found standardized amphora of fermented fish sauce from Pompeii to Roman-era Britain, transported thousands of miles across open sea because the demand for it was that consistent and that intense. The Israelites of the ancient coast traded in versions of it. The fishermen of the Sea of Galilee produce forms of it, and the principle behind it is exactly the same principle behind the fish sauce you can find today in the Asian grocery sections of supermarkets from Houston to Los Angeles to the strip malls of Northern Virginia, where Southeast Asian immigrant communities have built their food culture around it. Garum, fermented fish sauce produced by packing whole small fish in salt and allowing enzymatic and bacterial fermentation to liquefy the protein over months, is a condensed delivery system for one of the most important nutritional compounds in human biology, omega-3 fatty acids. The fermentation process does not destroy EPA and DHA. It concentrates them. It also produces free amino acids, particularly glutamate, that make fermented fish sauce one of the most powerful natural flavor enhancers ever produced, a fact that explains why adding a small amount of it to a dish creates a depth of savory flavor that no individual herb or spice can replicate. Studies on traditional fish sauce consumption in Southeast Asian populations show associations with reduced cardiovascular risk, lower inflammatory markers, and improved gut microbiome diversity. This is not coincidence. It is the omega-3 and probiotic content delivering results that have been consistent across cultures for 5,000 years. Traditional use was a small amount used as a flavoring in cooked dishes, salad dressings, and sauces. You do not consume it by the cup, you use it the way the ancient world used it, as a concentrated medicine hidden in plain sight as seasoning. Number 20. Fermented grape must. The Genesis ferment, the one that started everything. And here we are, number 20. The one I save for last, because it represents not just the beginning of wine, but the beginning of humanity's conscious relationship with fermentation itself. Before wine, there was must, freshly crushed grapes with skins, seeds, pulp, and juice, all fermenting together in an open vessel under the harvest sun. This is not wine. Wine is a clarified, aged, settled, finished product. Must is the living, churning, enzymatically explosive transformation in progress. The moment before completion. The event horizon between grape and wine. And it turns out that this intermediate state, this living in between, may be the most medically powerful form of the grape that exists. During active must fermentation, wild yeast on the grape skins, primarily Saccharomyces enhancing the asper species, produce not just alcohol but an enormous library of secondary metabolites that the filtering and aging and sulfite addition of finished winemaking removes or diminishes. Glycerol, which has skin protecting and gut coating properties. Succinic acid, which inhibits the growth of pathogenic bacteria, a complex of live yeast and bacteria in their most metabolically active state, producing enzymes and organic acids at a rate that finished wine simply cannot match because the fermentation is over. The grape solids in the must deliver a fiber matrix that carries these compounds deep into the colon, feeding the microbiome in a way that filtered wine cannot replicate. The polyphenol concentration in fermenting must is higher than in finished wine because the skin maceration is ongoing and the polyphenol have not yet oxidized or been removed by fining agents. Resveratrol, anthocyanins, quercetin, and epicatechin are present at their peak. Noah planted a vineyard after flood, the first agricultural act of the New World. He understood what grapes could become. But before the wine was the must, before the finished product was the living process. And the living process, it turns out, may be the most medically powerful form of all. Traditional use was fresh must consumed within the first days of harvest fermentation, what ancient texts called new wine or sweet wine, as a seasonal restorative. A living tonic of concentrated polyphenol, active enzymes, and wild cultures at their absolute peak. 20 ferments. Thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about what living food does to the human body, and what modern gut science keeps finding, study after study, decade after decade, is that the biblical world had the microbiome figured out long before we understood what a microbiome was. They did not use the word probiotic. They used the word life. They built their entire food culture around living foods. Fermented dairy, fermented grains, fermented vegetables, fermented fruits, fermented fish, fermented honey, that continuously inoculated the gut with the bacteria that make human health possible. The gut crisis we are facing right now, and it is a crisis, the explosion of autoimmune disease, inflammatory bowel disease, anxiety, depression, and metabolic dysfunction that is reshaping American healthcare from the hospitals of Boston to clinics of rural Mississippi, maps almost precisely onto the moment we replace living fermented food with pasteurized, sterilized, shelf-stable substitutes that are chemically similar but biologically dead. We broke the chain of fermentation that had fed human guts for 10,000 years. And we are paying the price in chronic disease rates that previous generations would have found completely incomprehensible. Here is what I want you to walk away with today. You do not need a supplement protocol. You do not need a probiotic capsule costing $50 a month from a company that has existed for 10 years, selling a product that claims to replicate something humans have been doing for 10,000. You need to do what people have done since Genesis. Take food, add salt, or wild culture, or raw honey, and wait. Fermentation is not a technique. It is a relationship with the living world that your ancestors understood and that your body is still waiting to be reconnected to. Before I let you go, quality matters more than anything else on this list. Raw honey for fermented garlic honey means actually raw, from a local beekeeper or small producer, not commercially processed honey that has been heated and filtered until every living enzyme and wild yeast is gone. Whole milk from quality pasture-raised animals for yogurt and kefir. Organic vegetables for lacto-ferments, because pesticide residues can inhibit the very bacteria you are trying to cultivate. The foundation ingredients determine the quality of the living culture you are building. Do not undermine a 4,000-year-old tradition by starting with industrially compromised ingredients. Drop a comment below and tell me which ferment you are starting with. Are you going straight for the fermented garlic honey? Starting simple with sourdough? Hunting down real lacto-fermented olives? Curious enough about ancient boza to actually try making it? I read every single comment. If you have not subscribed to Recreational Roots yet, hit that button right now and ring the bell. We post every single week. Ancient wisdom, modern science, and the kind of food knowledge that used to be passed down through generations and that we are bringing back together. See you in the next one.